The scene opens up where our protagonist stated that it was so bright that he couldn't open his eyes and couldn't even breathe properly there. He wondered who he was and remembered that he was Shuaib. The protagonist was lying somewhere and further stated that he was born on the 7th of January and was 23 years old, a single man who never had a girlfriend. He then further commented that he started his first job at a sales department of a web advertising company, and soon he would complete his first year. His hometown was Gyauda in Saitama Prefecture and currently lives in Kaname town. He thought about what he was supposed to be doing there and then realized that he must have been admitted from being a complete dumbass as he got drunk and fell off a balcony and somehow broke his bones. He further thought that he must have caused a lot of trouble for the company also and might be fired. Right after, he tried to open his eyes and got stunned to see where he was and what happened. He tried to stretch his hand and then found that his whole body was covered by a black thing, and he wondered what those super weird strings were and why he was completely wrapped in that thing. He realized that his hands could move. His legs felt as good as new and pondered if he was naked. While he was wandering around in confusion, he came across a cave-like structure. He went closer to it, and upon seeing it inside, he found that it was all covered with rocks. He somehow made his way out of it but was stunned by what he saw next as it was a subway, and he wondered if it was for a metro. The subway was so huge, and he thought about how old that subway was and if where the hell he was. Then he realized that was beyond his understanding and he wished if someone could help him. Afterwards, he pondered that he might get arrested if he went out in front of people all naked like that and they would never help him. So he decided to get dressed before finding someone, and suddenly he listened to the sound of some moving creature and he wondered if that was really bad as he couldn't just get in front of people like that at all, and just after a big wolf came to him and growled so loud. The protagonist was completely shocked and wondered if a wolf was there in Tokyo in a dream or if it was a robot, and then the wolf ran towards him and chewed his hand with its mouth. In the very next second the blood started to come from his hand and he thought that he was dying when the wolf again came to him and he shouted to give him a break and stated that he didn't want to die. Right after, the wolf jumped at him to attack, but as the protagonist waved his hand to protect himself, a sharp structure came from his hand which passed through the mouth of the wolf and killed him immediately. The protagonist contemplated that he was sure he saw a sword coming out of his palm and thought if that was a dream, and then denied. He further thought that he was so hungry and he wanted to eat something that time, and then he looked at the wolf lying in front of him and wondered if what the hell had happened to him as he was never such a strong person, and further stated that was the reality and having an empty stomach was hell. He commented even though he killed one wolf but he couldn't prepare a meal for himself as there was no pond or a source of fire around, and he clarified that the situation was bad and his hands were shivering. He contemplated that at that rate he would even eat raw meat, and suddenly someone asked him if he wasn't going to squeak the sporangium. He got up and looked around, and then a creature from his backside exclaimed that it was there. The creature was looking like a cute squirrel and it was having a stone in its head, as then it clarified the protagonist as Mr. Hunter and asked him if he could also let him squeak that. The protagonist's mind took a little time to load that as suddenly he got astonished and shouted that the squirrel spoke, and the squirrel attacked his face and stated that he was squeaking too loud and that would squeak out the other beasts there. The squirrel pulled his ear and exclaimed that the hunters squeak out metro beasts sporangium all the time, and he lined on the leftovers squeaked by them, and that was why he said to him to grow a pair and start squeaking that ghost wolf.
Hold on. If you guys are loving this video, make sure to comment, "We are loving it," because that is how I get to know that. Now, getting back to the story.
The protagonist took his sword as the squirrel commented to start by cutting open the belly of the wolf, and then he cut the thick skin, after which the squirrel told him that he didn't have to squeak the ribs as the sporangium was in the lower belly. The protagonist was feeling very weird doing that, and the squirrel said that there would be something ballish deep inside the body, and he put his hand into the body and grabbed a ball-like structure. Afterwards, the squirrel declared that some other beasts squeaking and fast, and then they both came out of that cave-like structure. He thought that in the end, they had to come back there, as the squirrel replied that it was a good hideout as those big beasts wouldn't be able to squeak through there. The squirrel further commented that the hole appeared because of those metro fluctuations which occurred before that day, and he asked about metro fluctuation and told that he was lying down there a while ago before that time, as he then asked if what exactly was that place. The squirrel replied that he would tell him later, and for that time to just squeak on the sporangium. And then the protagonist felt weird looking at the sporangium and thought if he was to eat that raw, as that was really a body organ and he really didn't want to eat it like that. The squirrel got mad and shouted that if he didn't squeak on it quickly then it would rot, and told him to eat that, as he then replied if he needed to curse at him so much. Afterwards, he ate that sporangium and asked if what was that, and the squirrel replied that he leveled up, to which he asked him what he meant by leveled up. The squirrel answered that it meant his body's kanji had expanded, and despite being a citizen of Idokuri, he was squeaking dumber than him. The protagonist got confused about what the squirrel was talking about, and then he commented that he didn't understand anything as he was not even a hunter and he was a regular employee. The squirrel then asked if it was an employee and commented that it really squeaked like a lame name. The protagonist denied and stated that his name was Shuaib. The squirrel got surprised by listening to it and stated that he also leveled up, as the protagonist then exclaimed that even squirrels got that level up system. To which the squirrel replied that he was not a squirrel and he was a magical beast who was the most famous carbuncle in the world, and he just used squeak a lot in his sentences. The squirrel gave its sporangium to him as he was full already and further exclaimed that he could squeak on the rest of it. The protagonist asked the squirrel if squirrels weren't supposed to eat grass, and then he put that sporangium into his mouth, and the squirrel commented that to level up twice like that he must be a really squeaky human. Then the protagonist replied that he was still weak as he just woke up a while ago, and had no clue about where he was at that time. He called out for Mr. Squirrel, and then he replied that he also had a name if he knew, and it was Tamiko. The protagonist then said sorry and asked him if where they were at that time and what year was that. The squirrel commented that they were currently squeaking at Utsuka Metro, which was approximately so many levels deep in the underground. He then further declared that he didn't know what year it was, but by the Tokyo calendar, it should be around year 102. The protagonist asked the squirrel about the Tokyo calendar, to which he replied that the metro was flooded 102 years ago, and the previous kingdom squeaked into ruins. The squirrel further added that they called it the New Tokyo, and his mama squeaked in his ear that it turned into the kingdom of Idokuri's people. After listening to it, the protagonist got surprised and asked what the hell. Afterwards, he went into his memories and remembered that there were frequent collapses occurring in the metro, and nobody knew why. So, at that time, it seemed like all lines were out of order. When he was in the hospital, two persons came to him and stated that visiting him had been really trouble, as since the new Otsuka station had gone out of order, they had to walk the mountain trail from Otsuka station to all the way there, and there was such a huge queue at the station waiting to get on a train that he couldn't even enter the platform. They mentioned further that they were calling it the Metro Flood on the TV. The protagonist remembered the Metro Flood and stated that he felt like he had heard it before, and further added that the day was really crowded everywhere, even inside the hospital. When he was in the hospital room, a nurse came to him and commented to evacuate that area quickly, after which he got worried and thought what was going on. And suddenly there was that huge earthquake which led to the cut of power supply, and it was all pitch black everywhere. The building was trembling as if it was going to collapse anytime soon, and then he felt like he was falling down along with his bed, and that was all he could only remember. Afterwards, the protagonist came back to reality and wondered if what Tamiko was saying was true. Then, the calamity must have happened along with the metro flooding event, and Japan, or perhaps the entire world, must have been destroyed by that. That was why that country named New Tokyo must have been formed. He then realized that was the timeline 100 years after that event. The protagonist exclaimed if that was impossible, as even if he was asleep for like 100 years, he was supposed to disappear from that world, and instead, he was as healthy as he was before the accident happened. The squirrel then asked if he was a person from the previous world, to which he replied that was what it looked like, but that sounded completely impossible. His squirrel further asked him if a normal person even squeaks that long, and then the protagonist denied and answered that he certainly didn't think that they lived for 100 years at least. He touched a fungal-like structure and further asked the squirrel about the black creepy thing in which he was wrapped when he woke up. The squirrel replied that it was mold, to which the protagonist asked if he was in a mold. The squirrel further asked if that also could be Kinu, and the protagonist was looking confused. Then the squirrel commented that it was so tiresome to squeak out an explanation to someone who didn't know anything at all. Suddenly the protagonist started rubbing Tamiko, and that made him mad. He replied to not squeak and touch him, as he would bite his finger off, and told him to stop. Just after, the protagonist touched Tamiko's chest, which made him so happy. He asked Tamiko if what was Kinu, to which he replied that it was an ability that squeaked control on his kenshi and further added that it was also called a skill. Afterwards, Tamiko got angry and told him to not stop that as he wanted more belly rubs, and then the protagonist asked him if that fungal element must be that mold or some kind of mushroom. Tamiko replied that all humans, including him, had that fungal filament squeaking inside him, and that was why he could make use of Kinu. The protagonist felt weird and asked the fungus residing within him if it didn't sound like there was a parasite inside his body. Tamiko, having fun with those belly rubs, replied that he squeaked that Ghost Wolf recently with Kinu. Afterwards, the protagonist wondered about the fungal ability, and that time he only wished to live, and then focused on his hand and concentrated on taking out the sword from his hand. In the very next moment, he got completely stunned as the sword was coming from his hand, and he commented that he really summoned a sword. To which Tomiko replied that was his fungal ability, and that was the fungal weapon which hunters used. He detached the sword from his hand and contemplated that it was an unpolished thirsty blade, and it was light and looked very sharp as if it was a real sword. To which Tomiko replied that it was right and that was his stiff and sharp thing. The protagonist asked him what he was supposed to mean, and then Tomiko stated that hunters from people of Ikutori used their fungal ability to squeak out the resources of the metro, and they ate the sporangium and grew stronger and then squeaked even the bigger ones. The protagonist asked if the sporangium of the metro beasts were like their reproductive organs or something like testicles, and further added that it seemed like they were descendants of the animals that survived the metro pandemic that happened 100 years ago. After that, Tomiko asked about the pandemic and stated that he used another disturbing word. He further asked Tomiko if he stated that was Utsuka Metro, and if that was near Sugamo or Ikebukuro, as he then replied that he didn't know as he had never squeaked on the surface, and he had only learned about humans and his language from his mama. She used to squeak monsters along with hunters in the past and was very knowledgeable about things. The protagonist asked Tomiko what it would take to go back to the surface, to which he replied that it was impossible, as he was a weak person and he was just nothing but a small tick in that vast metro. He further added that if he remained careless in the metro, then he would be squeaked by the likes of metro beasts such as that ghost wolf from earlier even before he knew it. Afterwards, he would just squeak into poop in no time. The protagonist exclaimed that he didn't want to be a poop. Then Tomiko exclaimed that he had to climb a lot of stairs just to squeak on the surface, and there would be a lot of metro beasts squeaking in his way, further mentioning that it was impossible for him. After listening to it, he asked Tomiko about the possibility of another human coming down there. Tomiko commented none at all, as he was the first human he had ever squeaked at in his life. That was why he was so squeaking excited by seeing him there. He further added that it was unexpected for him to squeak at a shiny face around there. Then he replied by saying sorry for having a shiny, attractive face and exclaimed that was the worst of the worst. Tomiko commented that despite everything it was still him and told him to level up more so that he could become able to squeak up against the metro beasts, further mentioning to eat more and more sporangium and become a squeaking fierce hunter just like the one his mama teamed up with. The protagonist exclaimed that he didn't think that he would be able to do that alone. He hadn't prepared for anything and had no equipment and zero knowledge about anything that day. Then Tomiko jumped at him and stated that he would help him with the knowledge he had received from his mama. He would do his best to squeak with him in battles. Tomiko further commented that he was grateful. Then the protagonist asked why. He replied that he also wanted to squeak on the surface, as he had always been squeaking down there in the metro all his life. He expressed his desire to see it all, the sun and the towns built by the humans. Tomiko further added that his mama stopped squeaking that year. He would never be able to handle metro beasts on his own ever. That was why he wanted to help the protagonist in becoming stronger, and then told him to let them squeak on the surface together. And then there came a twist as the protagonist got to know that the squirrel was a female. After a while, they were at the underground basement level 50 and were going rampant with metro beasts. As the protagonist then wondered that he only had his fungal sword as his weapon and his companion was a squirrel. He asked himself what kind of adventure was that even. Further thought that he wouldn't understand until he found out by himself. Tomiko told him to stop squeaking. Then the protagonist gave his finger so that Tomiko could shake his hand. Afterwards, he said to Tomiko that he was looking forward to getting along with him. To which Tomiko replied that the squeaking was mutual, and she was going to give it her all. So let's squeak their best. Judging from that outcome, those two would probably spend 5 years on that level. The protagonist told her to treat him gently, to which Tomiko replied that it would be alright. As she was around her, it would be just like squeaking on a leafy boat. He further added that it was definitely going to sink, and then she replied to not be meanie, as she was serious if he knew, and they were going to squeak at the sun shining over New Tokyo even before he knew it. Chapter 2. The scene opens up where our protagonist looked at the roof of the room and felt confused. Then a nurse came to him, and he told her that was where he was admitted. She replied that it was time to have a meal. After a while, he got a little mad as he realized that he was watching a dream, and the doctor asked him how he was feeling. The protagonist asked the doctor when he would be discharged, to which he answered that once he had leveled up sufficiently. Suddenly the scene reversed to reality as Tomiko's tail touched his face. She wished him good morning and commented that it was bright outside. Then he put her aside from his body. He exclaimed that the nightmare kept going even after he woke up and wondered if that was the 50th level of Utsuka Metro. From what Tomiko told him, that seemed to be a vast labyrinth spread out deeply right under Tokyo, and then agreed that it was so bright there. Tomiko pointed towards something and commented that it was a firefly nest, and further added that the morning squeaked bright in there, and the nights were squeaked in blueness. The protagonist asked her if they fell asleep just like that before that day and further added that he was really feeling very hungry and thirsty. He wished if they could find some water, as Tomiko then replied that they should squeak to the oasis. He asked her about the oasis, and then they again entered into the cave where he killed the wolf. He got surprised by looking at the wolf and commented that it looked like he had already turned into some sort of seed plot, further mentioning that there was no light reaching towards it. Tomiko exclaimed that was just how fungus squeaked, and there were a lot of fungus squeaking in the oasis. Afterwards, he wondered about the incident when he summoned his sword from his hand through his fungal ability, and further thought about that blackish mold from earlier having healing properties. Then he realized that for that time he knew that he could use those two abilities and contemplated if there were more. Just after, Tomiko told him to go there, and as they reached, the protagonist got stunned by watching the plants and trees there. He clarified that as incredible. In the very next second, he got tensed as he listened to some sound, and she replied that it would be okay. With her fungal ability, she could pick up the tiniest of squeaks and further added that there was no one squeaking nearby, and those were just small rats and other animals. Tomiko exclaimed to look as if there was water squeaking. The scene then shifted to the area near the pond where our protagonist was drinking the water with the help of his hands and clarified it as delicious. While he was drinking, he realized that sensation was something else. He had never drunk such tasty water before, and then he made a noise to which Tomiko commented that making noise was squeaking rude if he knew. She then moved closer to the pond to splash the water on her face and wiped her face with the leaf. She got cheerful and exclaimed that she had done the cleaning herself. Afterwards, the protagonist asked her about the red jewel on her forehead, to which she replied that even her mama had one and might be that was how squirrels were. He asked her if that was so and touched her jewel, as she then got mad after it and stated to him not to touch it, as it was very squeaking sensitive. Just after, the protagonist rubbed her chest, which made her so overwhelmed, and asked her if she was pretty easy to understand. He then commented to find some food, as he had never seen plants like those in his entire life. She exclaimed to squeak it to her and pointed towards a plant, mentioning that as squeaking bad news, and indicated then towards another plant, stating them as edible. She told him to look at a plant that was squeaked like acorn dandelion, and then she went to eat it. He agreed and wondered if she was definitely a squirrel. He then looked around his surroundings and guessed that was how things were, further adding that it didn't seem like there was enough to satisfy his hunger, but that place was really something else. He stretched a withered grass and contemplated that it looked so smooth and perhaps had some good properties. He further thought that since that grass was very sturdy, he could use that like a thread, and if he collected a lot more of those, then he would be able to make a bed for himself. Just after, he looked at a giant leaf and wondered about it for a while. He then wrapped it around his waist and stated that finally he no longer needed to be naked, and it looked good for something so hastily made. He asked Tomiko if she sensed any wolves or anything, to which she answered that animals like them didn't squawk in there often. She further mentioned that her mama had squeaked in her ear that the carnivorous animals usually squeak away from the heavy floral smell of the oasis. He then questioned her if they would live there, to which she replied that if they squeaked in there, then they had nowhere to run. The protagonist agreed and pondered that there was no exception when it came to safety. After that, they spent their time setting up a base at their hideout by harvesting necessary goods, including the food stock, a stone knife, and a bed to make a basic living. The protagonist tried to make the fire with the help of wood and grass, but he exclaimed that it was so hard to make fire, to which she replied that was because those grasses were all squeaking damp. He grabbed the squirrel and added that there was one more thing which he wanted to ask, that there was some unexpected agility coming from him, and asked her if that was also a benefit from leveling up. Then, Tomiko got mad and commented that it was the time to stop being such a sissy. She further added to stop being so pathetic and squeaked it completely. He replied that he was just trying to keep the rodents away and then killed a rat. Afterwards, he took the rat's sporangium in his hand and she commented that it was so small, to which he replied that was because he couldn't handle stronger beasts like Ghost Wolf, and picking up on smaller animals was perhaps the safest way to level up for that time. Tomiko exclaimed that it was going to be squeaking tough for him to level up like that, and she knew that he was a small squeaky human. But it was going to take like 10,000 rodents before he leveled up, and if he was going to hurt, she suggested he try squeaking against a ghost wolf or a blue goblin, as either of them were fairly weak for him to squeak against them. The protagonist asked her about the goblin, to which she replied that it was a monkey-like creature with dense fur all over their squeaking body. She further added that there were 3 types of goblins, red, blue, and green, among which the blue one was stronger than a green one on the same level as a ghost wolf. He exclaimed that it was above his level and asked her if they couldn't go for the green goblin. She replied that the floor only had the blue and red ones squeaking, mentioning that the red goblins squeaked danger as they were above level 15 and could apparently squeak out the fungal ability. He stated that they were definitely avoiding them, and then she replied that they could squeak out fungal weapons or sometimes fungal balls too. He asked her about the fungal balls and commented that he couldn't imagine, guessing perhaps it was a tool that could be thrown. He asked her further if she could use something like that, and she then replied that she couldn't do anything like that as she was a squeaking female. Afterwards, the protagonist exclaimed to keep a lookout near their hideout's entrance, and she stated that when he sensed a blue goblin or a ghost wolf nearby, it would be their battle for survival, and she would take care of picking up their bones. After listening to this, he got surprised by knowing that she was also helping him. The next scene then shifted to 3 days later at the lookout where Temiko was waking up the protagonist and told him to squeak up as there was one nearby coming towards them. The protagonist got alert and wondered that finally it was the time, and he asked her if that was a ghost wolf or a goblin. She replied that there were both, and both of them were fighting, as wolves and monkeys didn't get along well together. She further told him to squeak in when the fight was over and squeak up on the last standing beast and backstab them. He wondered about that third-party advantage, and in the very next moment, his hands started shivering while holding the sword. Then Tamiko said to him to squeak up and hold the sword together. He stammered that he had no choice but to do it. He wanted to go to the surface. Just after, he started focusing and stated to Tamiko that there they went, and that was their first step. In the next moment, the protagonist was watching the fight between the goblin and wolf. He identified that goblin as a blue one and wondered if he was a meter tall. He further clarified that the goblin was ferocious and very nimble, and considering the level difference between the two, the ghost wolf was dominating. Just after, the ghost wolf attacked the goblin, and the goblin screeched. The protagonist wondered if the ghost wolf triumphed. Suddenly, the ghost wolf got hit by some other creature, and the protagonist got stunned by watching it. Tamiko then commented that another creature squeaked in the fight and identified that creature as the red goblin who could squeak out the fungal needles. Just after that, the red goblin threw the fungal needles over the wolf, and then the wolf took a very long jump over the goblin and killed him straight away by putting him in his mouth. The protagonist was completely stunned and worried after that. He commented that it was madness, further mentioning that either the red goblin was weak or perhaps that the ghost wolf was the strongest one. He started shivering again at that moment and further asked her if he would really be able to win against those terrifying monsters, as that cornered wolf was the most terrifying one of them all. Right after, he ran towards the wolf and said to Tamiko that he would leave the bone picking to her. Chapter 3. The scene opens up where the protagonist was holding the sword at waist length with a skirt and was charging at the wolf while screaming. The wolf stared at him as he then wondered that if his co-workers saw that sight unfolding, then they would send him back to the hospital. He screamed in a very loud sound and killed the wolf by slashing his sword. Tamiko ran to him and stated that he was all bloody and further added not to squeak to die, as he then replied that he was fine and he would be cured soon. He further exclaimed that his opponent was heavily wounded, and that was the outcome that he won in the end. And it was also amazing that even such an injury could be healed, as he then wondered about the monster there. Tamiko exclaimed that was amazing as he was back to how he was before the fight, and stated to him that if he was squeaky, then he had to hurry up and extract the sporangium to squeak it. Suddenly, he listened to a growling sound and looked towards his behind and found that the goblin was still surviving. He tried to take out his sword from his hand, but he realized that it would not come out and wondered if it was because his wounds weren't fully healed that he couldn't muster any energy. Right after, that goblin ran towards him to attack and hit him directly towards his chest, which made the protagonist fall on the ground. The protagonist wondered, even being on the verge of death, that goblin packed quite a punch. Just after, Tamiko jumped and came near to him. She was trembling and said to him that she would squeak and suggested he squeak away. After then, he tried to grab Tamiko in his hand, but he missed, and then she told him to not get overwhelmed by that, as if she didn't do this then they would die. Just after, the protagonist got stunned as he looked at his finger and found that some thread-like structure was coming from its tip. He wondered if that was blood, but later he realized that it was not blood and it could be a fungal ball. And then he screamed to Tamiko to get away when she was moving towards the goblin. Right after, he threw a ball at the face of the goblin, and in the very second it burst with a very loud sound. Tomiko exclaimed that it was a fungal ball, and that burst made that goblin fall on the ground as the protagonist then took his sword and killed the goblin immediately. The next scene then shifted after a few hours when the protagonist was lying down on the ground, and Tomiko called out his name to wake him up. She told him to squeak his mouth as she was feeding him the sporangium, and then he got up and found Tomiko so emotional as she then asked him what was wrong. Squeak. He commented that he was fine and it seemed like he had leveled up, to which she replied that she was so glad. And then he asked her about the blood on her face and the goblin. She declared that it was not her own blood and set him to look around him as he then found 3 of the beasts were lying there, and he realized that he survived, further mentioning that he couldn't believe it as a completely unbelievable life-threatening situation unfolded and an average man like himself who was living a carefree life survived it. Afterwards, Tomiko was amazed and clarified that it was a complete victory as they got 6 sporangiums in just 1 squeak. Then he wondered about that structure which was attached to his finger. He exclaimed that he felt some enjoyment there, and then Tomiko replied that fungal balls squeak in 2 types. If he ate it, then he would recover, and if he threw it, then it would explode in flames. She told him that he could heal if he ingested that, and he wondered about the incident when he threw the fungal ball over the goblin, and he caught on fire immediately after the explosion. And then he further asked her if it could be that as if he had that skill and he could make a fire, to which she replied squeak. After a while, the protagonist burned the meat and stated that with the acquisition of the flammable fungal balls, he had improved his survival there by a tiny margin. He further added that he had also obtained a throwing weapon for battles, but that didn't make him a capable fighter. It became a capable routine for Tomiko to carefully bait monsters for him to take down. He stated that he could move better than before, but all he could do was barely move with all those injuries. She exclaimed that she was sure squeaked with that blue goblin for a long time, and he asked her about her level, and if she did have any skills to help him in the battle. She commented that small animals fought small, and she wouldn't be much use if she squeaked. She further added that she was squeaking with the feeling that she was going to remain there all the time. The protagonist contemplated that it would be difficult if Tomiko got caught by the wolves, and she should cling to him after all. Then she told him that there used to be a super metro beast around that area, and if it had been there, then he would have been pooped by that time. Then one day something changed when they both were sitting together and having the food, including a pelt, mushrooms, and sporangium in front of them. Tomiko commented that he squeaked well for that day's harvest again. Both of them extended their thanks to God for the food, and just after he bit a sporangium, he felt a sudden heat at his back. Tomiko asked him if what was squeaking, and he replied that he felt like his back got hotter. She further added that if his back was hot, then it meant he got a new kinu. He asked her if it was real, and if that was so, then what should he do at that time, to which she answered to try squeaking some out like last time, and then he started concentrating and chanting. Right after, he found that some big thread-like structures started coming from his hand, and Tomiko exclaimed that it was his new kinu. Then those threads were converted into the shield. The protagonist hit that shield with his sword and commented that it felt just as hard as his fungal sword. He further added that it wouldn't serve him offensively, but at least it would help in the battle. After a while, he killed a wolf and realized that the shield repelled bite and claw attacks, and he could use that as a diversion. He then further thought if that was the first time when he came out unscathed. Tomiko called out her name, and they started dancing while grabbing the shield. At that moment, he was improved to level 7, and Tomiko commented that it was so good, as it was quite something that he should keep squeaking at that rate, after which he agreed and asked her about her level. Later on, he calculated something and commented that it had been half a year since he had woken up there, and he had changed a little. After a while, a wolf was coming to him, and then he brought a shield from his hand and held it tightly. The wolf started running to him, and as he jumped to attack, the protagonist put his shield in front of him, and the wolf got crashed into the shield straight away. Just after, through his fungal ability, he took out the sword from his hand, and that wolf bit him immediately, which made him completely stunned. Tomiko screamed at him to look behind him, as another wolf was coming to attack him, and he just slid to protect himself from that other wolf. The wolf then fell down over the ground, and he stated that he got scared. Then Tomiko commented that his squeaking sound silenced that one's footsteps, to which he replied that even he didn't notice that one. The protagonist said sorry to the wolf and put his sword into its neck, and both the wolves were killed. At that time, he got moved to level 17. The scene was initiated where the protagonist was sitting under a tree, and there were many plants, and even the water was flowing there. He exclaimed that he had gotten used to living there in half a year, and Tomiko replied that he had gotten stronger. He was squeaking quite well that day and further added that it was all possible because of her guidance, to which he replied that he had already passed her level. Tomiko was at level 14, whereas the protagonist came at level 17. He contemplated that even he had leveled up quite a bit, and his body felt stronger, but there was no outward change. That meant the fungal filament got stronger instead of him. He further mentioned about the things he had, including his clothes, which were made out of a wolf's pelt that was dried and sewn together using a straw string. The bowl made out of stone mixing mycelium leaves with hot water to make a tea of sorts was one of the few luxuries available. A canteen to hold water made out of a wolf's bladder, and a bag made through trial and error using wolf skin and straw things. He commented that it had been more than half a month since the last level up, and he wondered if their level was too high, and they should increase just from killing wolves. Then Tomiko replied that was true, as they could no longer squeak against them. He said that she didn't join in the fight, though. She asked him if he wanted to squeak it up a notch, and he contemplated that the metro beasts had the sporangium inside of them, but they didn't reproduce at the same rate as a mushroom's fungal spores. They breed normally through male-female propagation. He further remembered that once he caught a glimpse of a newly born ghost wolf, and their numbers weren't so small that he could exterminate an entire species by himself. He wondered about what sort of influence would an overhunting of it have on the ecosystem, and if that were to happen, would the strongest class monsters start dominating that level, as further mentioning that strong monsters included ogres, orthrus, and others. Tomiko commented that they could squeak at that trash level for a bit more and enjoy their prosperity, to which he replied that she had got no drive and asked her if he could meet a woman around 30 in the metro, and if she didn't think they should take the next step and try ascending. She stated to him that even though he was still half-ranked in terms of strength, he sure squeaked confidence, and further added that the squeak from a noob to intermediate was one filled with danger, as he then replied that was reasonable. She exclaimed that once he squeaked a bit more to level up, then they could switch their main target to the red goblins. He didn't take her saying seriously, and then she told him in a serious tone that goblins were a dastardly bunch. They stink like asses, they were dirty, and they never shut the squeak up. She further added that their disgusting laughs were annoying, and they would eat anything from a roach to a wolf. They chased her around on more than one occasion. She was being mad while commenting about them and stated that she would squeak them so hard that they would go extinct. The protagonist asked her if that was her personal grudge, as although he was the one who was fighting. Then she exclaimed that their turf and their hideout were in different locations, and therefore, while they were en route, they might come across other strong beasts. He declared that situation is bad and asked her if she should go collect the information first. Then she gave him something and started to eat that instead of worrying, to which he replied that he would do that. Just after swallowing that thing, he felt warmth on his back, and he told Tomiko that his back got hot at that time. She then commented that it was a new skill in a while and told him to try squeaking it. Afterwards, he told her to step back a bit and started concentrating on taking out his new skill. Suddenly, a fungal ball came out from his finger, and he asked what use it had. He threw that ball at the tree and thought if that was wrong. And in the second, a rat came out there, as he then grabbed him and thought if that had an effect only if he ate it, as he didn't notice anything different. Tomiko commented that it seemed a little too lively, as he then asked her if she could talk to that guy. And that made Tomiko mad. She told him to not lump her in together with that son of a bitch, and further added for him to find a rock to squeak to talk to. And after he asked her if she was sure that she wanted to say that, he commented that the next experiment was that they were going to eat his balls. After listening to it, Tomiko got mad, as she then stated that it was animal abuse and told him to keep his stinky balls away from him. Just after, she got happy as the protagonist put something in her mouth, and she replied that it was so juicy, and there was a faint taste of sweetness. She further thought if those were the sweets from outside that her mummy told her about, as he then stated that it was not that. He exclaimed that it didn't seem to be poison, and he wouldn't say it was very good, but it made him feel like he was energized a bit.